Recently, I found myself reflecting on my history with watches. In one form or another, I have been interested in watches for about 14 years, and I thought about my different chapters during this time and how my interests, my collections, and my style in watches somewhat changed. And looking back, I think I can see somewhat of a pattern. My next thought was that, well, when I can see a pattern in my behavior, how do collection journeys from other people look like? Are there general patterns? Things that are the same and things that are repeating themselves? So I looked up if there was something like a psychology of collecting, and that actually somewhat is a thing. So I have picked several points from the general understanding of collecting and adopted them for watches here. This obviously is in no way a scientific work, and my experiences are of course purely anecdotal, but the parallels are fascinating. Maybe you can also find similarities in your experiences. So let us know in the comments, and I think this is going to be fun. In this video, I have 3 segments for you today. The first segment is the 4 phases of a collecting journey, followed by the different types of collectors and the driving reasons for collections and collectors. In my personal journey, I could make out roughly 4 phases. The first phase is sort of the discovery phase. The first time you see a watch with different eyes, the first contact to mechanical watches, the first watch, something cool is hiding in plain sight and you suddenly get hooked. At this stage, you purely buy what you like, because you just don't know better, right? It's the purest phase and it happens often independent of price and status of a watch, or so we like to think in hindsight. Because later you learn how vulnerable you truly were for marketing. You slip right into the phase of random acquisition. You suddenly find a universe of niche knowledge, history and engineering. You discover so much in such a short time, and you pick up the names of one brand after the other. This goes often hand in hand with a steep learning curve, and this is on so many levels that you are really influenced by marketing, and in the beginning, marketing sort of teaches you something. You learn all the basics from marketing before you try to read more deeply into it. The evolution of your knowledge can, in hindsight, often be seen in the differences between your watches from this period. You like to have something from everything. Me, for example, I really had everything. In this phase, you also form your grails. But also, this is maybe the phase where you try to make shortcuts to those grail watches. Maybe you try to substitute a watch that you can't afford with a similar looking watch, or a watch that tries to sell itself on the same functionality or something. And so you go on and watches start to pile up until you enter the phase of reorganization. For me, this is the third phase, really, and you start to arrive at the point where you gain a little bit of distance. Usually it's a sudden change in the lookout at watches, and you see maybe mistakes were made here and there. This phase of reorganization also goes along with finding and defining your own taste out of all those watches you basically gathered. You maybe figure out that there are some watches that you don't wear as much, and you get rid of them and therefore buy something else. You also maybe try to reduce the number of watches who do the same thing. If you have a couple of chronographs, have a couple of dive watches, you maybe realize that you don't need all of these chronographs or all of those dive watches who essentially do the same thing, and you realize that you can't wear all the watches at the same time, and instead of having 5 dive watches, you maybe go down to 3 dive watches. This phase of forming taste and reducing the collection, in my experience, also happens along a trend line. It can be steel sport watches, diving. Recently, for example, a lot of small Cartier watches who inspire a lot of people to redefine their taste. And often during this phase, I think you also get to learn a lot about yourself, because you, for the first time, start to look back on what your journey is and check your knowledge in order to, forget about things that are maybe not true. You see a little bit more clear in the forest, I would say. And then the last phase for me is patronism. And eventually, in my experience, you find a niche and you eventually become somewhat of a scholar for a brand or a reference number or a certain complication. and you start to become a close fellow of a specific brand or a specific type of watch. You really want to go more into the depth, and you maybe try to take on some projects, or you do a little bit of research, and you really certainly go niche on certain things. And along this timeline, or during this phase of reorganization before, people tend to follow different approaches of collecting, and they start to follow a path and become a certain type of collector. This brings us to the next field, which is the types of collectors. And I don't say that you have to be one of those, this is like an observation. And this, by the way, is for all of what I'm saying, is if you have further ideas or know more about this topic or have thought about it more deeply, then write it down in the comments and I'm happy to learn from you. And I'm sure everyone else will also be glad for your input. So the three types of collectors in my observation are, first of all, a generalist who buys everything from the standpoint of pure interest, watches from different categories, different ages, different price points, coexist in his type of collection. And I guess most of us can identify with being this type of collector, at least at some point in our journey. People, for example, who can afford to buy from independent watchmakers are often people who basically bankroll certain projects and certain ideas. And they don't have to be specific, they can be very broad, and they can wear a modern Richard Mille and at the same time own, I don't know, a Rescep or something like that. I think this all goes together. Then there's the second type, who is a little bit more narrow in its path, and I would call this type of collector the completist. And the completist is on the journey to collect all variations of a specific model or category, form a complete and complementary set of watches. Fulfilling those sets is basically the main goal, getting all the Moon's watches or all the different Submariners. So this type of collector is found independent from a certain budget. It can be any price range, from a Swatch to a Patek. Another type of collector I would call the scholar, and he has some of the traits of the completist, but instead of the completist, I guess the scholar is more into collecting knowledge. He owns the watches primarily to derive information from them, not just to own them. And this often goes beyond the watch as an object and is more focused on the specific brand or functionality. And owning the watches is really only one part, because only having it gives you the information you want to collect. I don't at all want to say that one type of collector is any better than the other, but it seems to me in many cases that starting as a generalist, going to be some form of completist, and then turning out to be somewhat of a scholar is likely a path that people experience during their years if they stick to watches. This obviously can have many different levels and variations. I also wanted to see what driving reasons for forming a collection can be. I don't just want to look at trends, but think a little bit more about it. I believe that the journey to shaping a collection is knowingly or unknowingly by some form of reasoning. And some of these could be emotional value of watches, a search for knowledge, prices, and seeing watches as investments can also be a reason for a collection. Also, obviously, the status of a certain brand or watch can be a reason, and obviously any and all combinations of these points. And this is interesting because now you can look to your own collection and try to identify what are the subconscious reasons driving me buying certain watches. And that's where it gets interesting. In watches and collecting, we also see different trends, and sometimes even the industry adjusts to those trends with new releases. And an example for that was reissues of watches from the 40s and trying to make them adaptable for today's market. And obviously things like faux patina, colored hands, colored lume, fake aging of dials and stuff like that. So nostalgia can also be sort of a unconscious reason to collect a certain type of watch. I also try to identify some major trends that shape the landscape of watches and watch collecting. And I guess also the value of a watch depends on those major trends for the most part. And one general rule I could find is that people in their 30s and 40s usually collect what they were familiar with in their youth. And that's why we see prices for vintage watches falling a little bit, aside from, key cornerstone pieces, and falling a little bit out of trend, and 80s and 90s watches coming more into the focus. And the same thing sort of also happens with cars at the same time, where maybe a Porsche 356 is not as interesting to people anymore from a certain age group than, for example, a 944 Turbo. And connected to that is that prices usually only hold up as long as there are collectors for that item. A good parallel, for example, here is the art market, where you can have maybe 5 to 10 people who really collect a certain artist on a global level. And then if the artist is dead and if those people die, there maybe is not enough interest in those artists anymore. And so the desirability and the prices for those artworks tend to drop before the artist's work then has to prove itself over the decades that this artist was important in a general sense. Another trend or another argument that I could find was watches do good if they retain some level of practicality. Wristwatches are more interesting because they can still be used in an everyday setting. Pocket watches are therefore not as desirable as they once were because you are very limited in using them. You can, but it has fallen out of fashion and people will look at you and maybe it's not practical in your job or daily applications. And so although they might be more interesting from a watchmaking standpoint, pocket watches are a great example for my first point about collectors. A third point is availability and novelty. If a brand or category has not been in the focus, there's a lot to discover from the perspective of new people coming in. And then there's talk about what are good deals. If something was in the focus for a longer time, things become more boring or they become more niche. The Rolex Submariner is a good example at the moment. It's high, but it is at no point the craze that it was 2 or 3 years ago. First, it was of little interest. Then subtle differences became known and opened up a wide world to be discovered. Based on that, the lineage of the Submariner was traced out and understood. And now everything, or mostly everything, has become expensive. So we start to question the value in relation to the experience we might have. The Cartier Crash, the Royal Oak, and Nautilus have been different examples. Sure, they are all hot watches at the moment, but are they because of importance or just because that's how the market works right now? And in my experience, talking about key cornerstone pieces like certain Cartiers, Royal Oaks, Nautiluses, Submariners, GMT Masters, Pepsi, all that kind of stuff, that is one side. But if you go down to the next layer, how interesting is a watch from the 1960s from a brand that is not super well known to you? Would you spend $2,000 on a watch from the 60s and really wear it? And maybe that is different if you're in your 30s and you're looking to watches from the 1990s. In my opinion, and to be honest, I believe most of what shapes our personal journey with watches is a continuous cycle of new discoveries, new knowledge, falling out of interest with pieces, and then looking for the next thing. And I think that's how most of us work. That makes us a little bit predictable, but at the same time, it's still individual and there's much to be discovered. And so far, these are my thoughts on this topic. Let me and let us know in the comments what you think and if you can recognize patterns from your own collecting journey. And maybe I can do another video taking all of these comments from you into account. So thank you for watching and I see you in the comment section.